Well, welcome to week 2 in our annual fall series. We're working with the book Falling Upward, A Spirituality for the Two Halves of Life. It's by this guy here, Richard Rohr, who is a Franciscan priest and an ecumenical leader and speaker who's very well known around the world. The two halves of life is this idea that we get from the Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst Carl Jung. He's the guy that founded the school of analytical psychology. And Jung is quoted as saying this. He says, the first half of life is devoted to forming a healthy ego. The second half is going inward and letting go of it. Now, this isn't about trying to rigidly divide life into two black and white fractional halves. You know, we're so used to thinking in terms of polarities, and that's not what this is. This isn't about a precise chronology, it's about a process, a moving process, moving from one stage to another along a continuum. Another way that we say it is that the first half of life is devoted to building a strong and healthy container. And we do that by establishing an identity. And that identity is often primarily based on things like career, achievement, our social groups, and especially our status within those social groups. Now, a big part of building that container is getting something that the author calls our narcissistic fix. I like that. That's a great term. Narcissistic fix. As in a fix you might get to satisfy a craving or perhaps even an addiction. You know, everybody needs to be validated. Everybody needs to know that they are valued. We need to know that we've been heard. We need to know that we matter. It's about us in those ways. That's what he means by narcissistic. And we need to get those things in a healthy way to know that we're valued, heard, and that we matter. Now, think about how teens go about this. Think about teen culture for a minute, right? They try to create, and they succeed up to a point, they try to create a validating environment for themselves in the form of a unique identity, right? In terms of their fashion, their hairstyle, their slang, their music, the cars they drive, and things like that. That's how they create that validating environment. Everyone wants to be a part of the in-group. Everybody wants to have that healthy mirroring to say that we matter, that we're heard, and so on and so forth. And we want it to be done in a healthy way, because when people don't get those things in a healthy way, that's when we see young people turn to things like gangs and extremist religions who provide that same fix, but in a very unhealthy way. But the one thing they have in common is that the validation comes from outside. It comes from others, from external sources, and can often be based on our appearance. We get validated simply because we wear the hairstyle that's popular. All right, it's normal, it's inevitable, but it can set this ongoing cycle in motion where we're constantly looking to externals for our validation. We look to externals for our identity, and those are the things that will ultimately fail us because it's constantly changing. It's constantly in flux. You know, for me, this part of the book really helped to shine some new light on a thing that we used to call the generation gap. Remember the generation gap that was all talked about in the 60s and 70s? The older generation watches the younger generation going through the very same identity and validation phase that they went through when they were younger. The only thing is that the younger generation is doing it differently than they did. How dare they? Yeah. They're doing the same thing, but it's with a different hairstyle, different clothing, different slang, different music, but the same goal, right? Kind of like this cartoon here. Got two old guys with their pants waist up around their chest. They're watching two other guys, young guys, walking down the street with their pants totally in the other direction. And they're saying, kids today, they really look like idiots the way they wear their pants. Pot, meet kettle, right? Right? Because they forget, basically, they forget about the stuff that they did when they were younger. These old guys apparently forgot all about that weirdness called bell bottoms, along with beads and bandanas, right? Right? Same dance, different partner. So, one of the observations that the book makes is that overall our culture and indeed human history seems to value this kind of externally validated identity over just about anything else. Here's the quote. Most of history has been the forging of structures of security and appropriate loyalty symbols to announce and defend one's personal identity, one's group, one's gender issues and identity. Now we seem to live in a time when more and more people are asking, is that all there is? Mm-hmm. And it's something that continues beyond our teen years. After we put away the adolescent fashions and slang, we can continue to be preoccupied with maintaining a sense of control and security and a level of certainty that becomes a hindrance to dealing with the inevitable change that we have to face. And it's always the kind of change that begins with that question, is this all there is? And we begin to wonder, what's beyond? What's more? In the book, he puts it this way. He says, thus, the first journey is always about externals, formulas, superficial emotions, flags and badges, correct rituals, Bible quotes, and special clothing, all of which largely substitute for actual spirituality. Yet, they are all used and needed to create the container. Yes, it is largely style and sentiment instead of real substance, but even that is probably necessary. Just don't give your life for mere style and sentiment. Even if we get this, even if we've reached the point in our life where we understand this, where we get this, wouldn't it be great to be able to communicate this so eloquently to someone who might benefit from hearing it? I mean, I think that's one of the great benefits of this book, is giving us this language and understanding that we might be able to use when talking about these issues. The second half of life is a metaphor. It's a metaphor for the process of moving beyond that kind of preoccupation with security, certainty, and control. And for me, a big part of this second half process is not just moving beyond those kinds of tribal concerns, but also to become more actively patient, inclusive, and more understanding of the stuff that people do, starting with teens and going onwards, all the stuff that people do during that first half of life. Here's how the author describes people who have started to move beyond that first half consciousness. He says, they do not create enemies, and they move beyond the boundaries of their own starter group, while still honoring them and making use of them. Jesus the Jew criticizes his own religion the most, yet never leaves it. Mature people are not either-or thinkers, but they bathe in the ocean of both and. Last week I mentioned that this book would draw upon the work of Joseph Campbell, who did extensive research into ancient and modern mythology, and he came up with this concept of the hero's journey. Now, Richard Rohr, he uses the hero's journey to illustrate this process of moving from first half consciousness to the second half. And if you really want to go into detail about the hero's journey, you could check out this book here, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, by Joseph Campbell. But for this morning, we're just going to do an overview of the 5 major elements of the hero's journey. And I might suggest during the rest of the week taking some time maybe to ponder how these elements, which and if any of these elements, have played out in your own life. So we'll start with stage 1. At stage 1, the hero lives in a world that they consider to be given and sufficient. It's often a comfortable existence, and perhaps even one that they take for granted, in the sense that they have no idea how quickly and radically it can change. Call it the comfort zone. And I think most of us are familiar with what that's like. We know what it's like to be in a comfort zone. Think about, from Star Wars, Luke Skywalker, back on the farm on his home planet with his aunt and uncle, living this quiet existence as a farmer, not really knowing what else is beyond the world, but very comfortable. And many times the hero at this stage is unaware of a key aspect of their true identity. They might have descended from royalty, or they might have something else in their heritage that's important and powerful and yet unknown to them, perhaps a superpower of some kind. Think of Luke Skywalker. He was one of the last descendants of the Jedi, but he didn't know it yet. Now this is something that we don't want to take too literally when we're applying it to our lives. I'm sure some of us here are actually descended from royalty, or maybe a Jedi, I don't know. But what this really means is that everyone has a unique talent or a unique gift that they're inclined to by a combination of things: genetics, history, natural selection. So part of the journey in the second half is to find out what that is. And if you already know what it is, then maybe to bring it to another level of development. So at stage 2 of the journey, the hero is called on to leave home. But they're not leaving home to solve or fix a specific problem. They're just being invited to go out beyond their current comfort zone. The details are not yet all that clear. They don't know what they're going to find. They're being called forth on an adventure, and they summon up the courage to take that step out of their comfort zone and to start the journey. You see some examples of this in the books The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, right? Bilbo and Frodo are called out to head out on this adventure, and they really have no idea of all the things they're going to encounter, but they embrace the journey. Luke Skywalker, he heads off with Obi-Wan Kenobi, knowing only that his old, comfortable way of existence had changed forever. Time to move on, but not exactly sure what he was getting into at that point. So then at the 3rd stage, the hero encounters a major dilemma. Whatever they thought their real problem was, turns out not to be the real problem. The real problem turns out to be something else entirely, and it almost always involves some kind of wounding, physical, emotional, or both. Luke Skywalker is confronted with the fact that his father is the dreaded and hated Darth Vader. And then dear old daddy defeats him in combat, cuts off one of his hands, his sword hand. But in the aftermath, what does he find out? Well, one of the things he finds out is that he has a sister. Right after that, he finds out that he has a sister. He still has family left to support him, a loss and a gift. The wound changes the very nature of existence by upending everything that he thought was his identity. Then at the 4th stage, that's where the hero realizes that what they thought of as the only task that they were facing is actually just the first task, the lead-in to the real task that they have to accomplish. Now, Luke thought that he was going to train to become a Jedi. But what Master Yoda shows him is something entirely different. Yoda shows him all of the physical training, right? He shows him the razzle-dazzle of the lightsaber and being able to move stuff with his mind. But he also shows him that the razzle-dazzle stuff is just a small part of what he's being called upon to do. The major task that was to be accomplished here was this inside job consisting of Luke having to master things like his fear, his doubt, his hatred, all of those things which turned out to be the real enemies which could truly destroy him. He was going to have to learn an entirely different way of thinking and being, and in that sense he was going to be discovering an entirely new self. And finally, the fifth stage of the journey, that's where the hero returns home and knows the place as if for the first time. You bring back something of great value to share with the rest of the community, to pass along to others. Now, in the case of Luke Skywalker, this part of the journey is just starting to be told in these new movies that have been coming out. I understand there's a brand new one coming out in December that's going to bring it home, so to speak. Luke is going to be a mentor and hopefully get to pass along his wisdom and his knowledge to Rey. Now, regardless of your chronological age, the person who returns home after going through this process is properly regarded as an elder. This person who has completed this five-stage process tends to very naturally fall into the role of leader or mentor, because it's only at the perspective of having completed this journey that they can look back and with wisdom see that everything that happened at each of the preceding stages was necessary, was somehow valuable to them in completing the journey and discovering what their true task, their true talent, their true identity is. Something I would recommend when life turns out to be challenging is to take some time to reflect on what aspects of this hero's journey might just be playing out in the situation. And if you have what you consider to be a difficult life story, try rewriting it. Literally. Rewrite it in the framework of this journey, because it can be hard to see the gifts and the beneficial transformation until maybe we put it into this context. Now, that's not saying that we have to be grateful for the difficulties or the hard times, or somehow force ourselves to be happy that it all happened. But the fact is that it did happen. And maybe, just maybe, there's a different way of looking at all of the stuff that happened that might lead to a greater sense of peace. We'll be meeting today in the youth and family area at 11:30. We've got some questions for these chapters, and they're in the handouts in your bulletin. Next week, we're going to delve into the first half of life at greater depth, and we're going to be exploring some of the interesting issues that are raised by this quote that I'm going to close with today. This is from an author named James Halves, who's a psychologist who wrote a book, Finding Meaning in the Second Half of Life. Here's what he says. The world is more magical, less predictable, more autonomous, less controllable, more varied, less simple, more infinite, less knowable, more wonderfully troubling than we could have imagined being able to tolerate when we were young. Some food for thought, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.